The sound of the phone echoed through the silent house. John Parker, a retired detective from the Chicago Police Department, opened his eyes suddenly, his heart racing before he even understood what was happening. He reached out in the dark, fumbling across the cold surface of the bedside table, knocking something to the floor before finally grabbing the phone. When he answered, the voice on the other end made him freeze. "John, you left me." That voice. He hadn't heard it in 20 years. His throat went dry, his breathing heavy. It was impossible. Clara Thompson had disappeared 2 decades ago, and the case still haunted his nightmares. It couldn't be her. It couldn't be real. The line was silent for a few seconds, and then the same fragile, cutting voice continued, "I'm still waiting." In the same place. John sat up in bed, the room suddenly claustrophobic, a sense of déjà vu tightening in his chest. The faint light of the moon filtered through the curtains, casting pale shadows across the furniture. He stared at the phone, trying to process what he just heard. But there was nothing to explain it. Clara, the girl he'd never been able to find, was calling out to him. He got out of bed, ignoring the stiffness of his aging body, driven by pure adrenaline. Memories of the case came back in waves, uncontrollable. Clara had vanished without a trace. No solid leads. No answers. He and his partner at the time, a young officer named Mark Turner, had scoured every corner of the city, following every possible lead, and in the end, they were left with nothing but questions. Clara's disappearance had become the unsolved case that marred John's otherwise flawless career. Sitting at his kitchen table, he opened his laptop and accessed the old case files. The clock on the wall read 2:45 a.m., but time felt irrelevant. The cold metal of the chair pressed against his skin, but he didn't care. He was searching for something, anything that could make sense of that call. But the records, which he knew by heart, offered no answers. It was as if Clara had been swallowed by the earth. Gone without a single trace. And now, 20 years later, she was calling him? The tension in the air was palpable, almost suffocating. John knew he needed more information. He needed to understand what was happening before it was too late. He opened the original missing persons report. Clara was 17 at the time. Only child, straight-A student, vanished while walking home after a late shift at a local diner. Her last known location? A deserted road on the way to the suburban home where she lived with her parents. There was one detail that always nagged at him, something he couldn't quite shake. The last call Clara made the night she disappeared. A brief phone call to a number they were never able to trace. And now, years later, it was him receiving a call from an unknown number. The connections were forming in his mind, each piece of the puzzle painfully familiar. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture of frustration that had followed him since his days in the precinct. The shadows in the kitchen stretched long, the feeling of isolation growing as the silence of the house seemed to press down on him. The ticking of the clock was the only constant sound. John stood up, moved by an impulse. He needed to see the place where Clara was last seen. The deserted road was still there, he knew. Nothing had changed in the sleepy little town since then. Without thinking much, he grabbed his car keys and left the house. The cold night air cut like ice, and the road leading to the suburbs was nearly as empty as it had been the night Clara vanished. As he got closer, the unease in his chest grew. Every mile he drove brought him closer to a shadow he feared facing. When he arrived, he parked on the side of the road and looked around. The silence was oppressive. The faint streetlights in the distance barely illuminated the path. But this was where it all began. This was where Clara's life had disappeared, and his had begun to unravel. John stepped out of the car, the damp asphalt reflecting the pale glow of the moon. He walked a few steps, his memory guiding him to the exact spot where Clara was last seen. The feeling of being watched was undeniable. The darkness seemed to hide him, as if something, or someone, was lurking, waiting. And then, the phone rang again. This time, he didn't hesitate to answer. The same voice broke through the silence. "I'm close, John. Will you find me this time?" The question echoed in his mind as his heart raced uncontrollably. Clara was there. Or someone was playing a cruel, twisted game with him. Either way, this was far from over. The drive back home felt longer than usual. John drove in silence, his face marked by confusion and uncertainty. The night was still dark, but the faint hints of dawn were beginning to streak the horizon. That phone call had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Clara Thompson had been missing for 20 years. There was no way she was alive. No way her voice was real. And yet, something about those words, the tone, the way she spoke, felt so authentic, it was impossible to ignore. As soon as he got back to his house, he sat at the kitchen table again, exhaustion starting to weigh on his shoulders. Clara's words echoed in his head. "Will you find me this time?" It sounded like a taunt. But who could be behind this? And why now, after all these years? John knew he needed help. Though he hated the idea of involving anyone else in this nightmare, his instincts pushed him toward an old contact, Sophia Clark, his former partner from his days on the force. She had been one of the best detectives he'd ever worked with, now a prominent figure in the local police. He hadn't seen her in years, not since he retired, but if there was anyone he could trust to help him unravel this twisted mystery, it was Sophia. With a deep sigh, he picked up the phone and dialed her number. The sound of the ringing seemed endless until, finally, Sophia's groggy voice answered. "John?" The surprise in her tone was obvious. Without wasting time, he explained the calls. Sophia, who was usually steady no matter the situation, paused several times, clearly unsettled by what she was hearing. "That doesn't make any sense," she said. "Clara's been missing for 20 years. It can't be her." John knew that better than anyone, but something inside him refused to believe this was just some cruel prank. Despite her skepticism, Sophia agreed to meet him the next morning. As he hung up the phone, John felt a mix of relief and unease. Something was very wrong, and the sooner they investigated, the better. Later that morning, with the sun finally breaking through the sky, John met Sophia at a quiet cafe in the heart of the city. She carried the same firm posture as always, but her eyes betrayed a hint of concern. "I need to see the old reports," she said after brief pleasantries. John had brought the case file on Clara, the pages yellowed and worn from years of handling. Together, they reviewed every detail, every lead that had once led to dead ends. As she flipped through the pages, Sophia paused and looked up at John, her expression hardened. "You think someone's messing with you?" The question lingered in the air for a moment. John knew it was possible, but he didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to accept that, after all this time, someone could be toying with his failure in such a cruel way. "I don't know," he replied slowly, "but something's not right." The information Clara mentioned, she talked about a place. A warehouse. "I never released that part. No one else knew." Sophia stayed silent, absorbing his words. If someone was behind this, then they knew details that had never been made public. That made it far more dangerous. Sophia closed the file with a deep sigh and looked at John with a seriousness he recognized as the sign of a significant decision. "If these calls are real, we need to check out that location she mentioned. Right now." John agreed. There was no time to waste. The warehouse Clara referred to was in an abandoned industrial area on the outskirts of town, a place they had searched countless times during the original investigation but had yielded nothing significant. Driving there brought back waves of frustration and failure for John, while Sophia remained silent beside him, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. When they arrived, the place was as deserted and decayed as he remembered. The silence was almost unbearable, with only the wind whistling through the rusted structures and the distant rustling of dry leaves blown across the empty streets. They stepped out of the car, both tense but focused. John led Sophia to the entrance of the warehouse, the same one he and his old partner, Mark, had investigated years ago. Something inside him told him this time would be different. As they entered the building, the darkness swallowed them. Sophia clicked on a flashlight, illuminating the time-worn walls. Then, on a grimy, decaying wall, something caught their attention, a freshly made mark, a strange symbol etched into the concrete. It hadn't been there before. John knew immediately they had found something important. Sophia looked at him, her face a mix of surprise and concern. Questions began to pile up in John's mind. Who had carved that symbol? What did it mean? And, more importantly, what was Clara trying to tell them with those calls? Sophia moved closer to the symbol, examining it carefully. John felt a shiver run down his spine as a terrible thought began to form. Clara wasn't just alive, she was sending a message, and they had barely scratched the surface of what it truly meant. The mark on the warehouse wall pulsed in John's mind like a faint, unsettling memory. He stood in silence, watching it as Sophia shone her flashlight over the symbol, leaning in to examine the freshly carved lines. That mark hadn't been there 20 years ago, and its presence only deepened the unease growing between the two of them. It was a reminder that someone had been there, maybe still watching, maybe waiting for them to make the wrong move. Every minute they spent in that place amplified the sense that something dark was unfolding around them. John moved closer to the wall, running his fingers along the cold, jagged edges of the symbol. The roughness of the carving told him it had been made recently. But by whom? And why? As the silence in the warehouse stretched, John's phone vibrated in his pocket, breaking the oppressive tension that had settled in the room. His heart raced again. He knew before even looking who it was. Clara. Her name glowed on the phone screen. He hesitated for a brief moment before answering, his body rigid with a mix of anticipation and growing fear. The voice on the other end was the same, soft and haunted, as if it was echoing from a place far away, unreachable. John, the voice whispered, then in a quiet, almost inaudible tone, Clara mentioned another location. A place he knew well. Somewhere south of the city, near where another case had gone cold many years ago. The warehouse, the mark, and now this new place. Each piece fit together in a way that could no longer be ignored. He knew they had to go there, even if it felt like they were walking straight into a trap. Sophia watched John as he finished the call, her eyes heavy with a mix of disbelief and concern. Did she say something? She asked, seeing his face tighten with a blend of exhaustion and growing tension. John nodded slowly. She talked about another place. South of the city. Near that old factory, the Matt Harris case, he answered, his voice sounding far away. The Matt Harris case, just like Clara's, was a mystery left unsolved. Another young man vanished, and no solid leads aside from vague suspicions that never went anywhere. The air in the factory was becoming suffocating, and Sophia suggested they leave immediately. The next step was clear, they needed to investigate the new location Clara had mentioned. But as they walked back to the car, the feeling of being watched grew more intense. John glanced over his shoulder more than once, but all he saw was darkness, the heavy silence, and the distant sound of the wind. Still, something inside him whispered that they weren't alone. Back in the car, the silence between them was tense. The engine hummed softly as they drove toward the new destination. The road south of the city was almost deserted, with only a few streetlights to guide them. The humid air condensed on the windshield, and John wiped the glass with his hand, though his thoughts were far away. Sophia, on the other hand, stayed alert. The case was unraveling too quickly, and the voice on the phone, the voice that should belong to someone who had been missing for decades, made her certainties waver. As they drove, John's mind wandered back to the Matt Harris case. He disappeared 2 years after Clara, and the two cases had never been officially linked. The police had treated them as isolated incidents, but something about it always bothered John. Matt vanished under the same mysterious circumstances, leaving school late at night, with no witnesses, no evidence. And now, Clara was mentioning a place near the old factory, as if it were all part of a web he hadn't seen before. Maybe, in some way, Clara had always known more than he'd realized. The factory to the south was as abandoned as the warehouse. It was a forgotten place, isolated, as if it had been deliberately erased from the town's consciousness. The large, rusted gate stood ajar, making it easy for John and Sophia to slip inside. The area had an almost surreal atmosphere, as though time had frozen, preserving its dark secrets. They stepped out of the car, exchanging silent glances. Sophia led the way with her flashlight, their footsteps echoing across the vast, empty space. The tension in the air was thick, and John mentally prepared himself for whatever was waiting for them inside. The silence was nearly absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of something shifting in the wind, or was it something else? As they moved deeper into the decaying factory, they entered a larger room where signs of recent activity became evident. Empty cans, scattered clothes. And in the center of the room, a crumpled piece of yellowed paper, hastily scrawled with a simple, chilling message. John picked it up, feeling the weight of each written word, "I'm close. Wait for me." Sophia stared at the paper, then back at John, her expression a mix of confusion and worry. Everything was starting to converge into something bigger, and the connection between Clara's and Matt's disappearances was becoming undeniable with each passing moment. But before they could fully process what they'd found, John's phone rang again. He looked at the screen. Clara. Her voice, more frightened than ever, whispered just one thing: "You're running out of time." Clara's voice echoed in John's mind as he stood there in the factory, the words "you're running out of time" clawing at his thoughts. He glanced at Sophia, who was still scanning the room with her flashlight, focused but clearly unsettled. He could see the same unease in her eyes that he felt growing inside himself. How did Clara know so much? How was she guiding them to these places like a prisoner still pulling the strings? The crumpled paper in John's hand felt heavy. The hastily written message, "I'm close. Wait for me," seemed like a bait, a carefully set trap. Every step they took was drawing them deeper into this maze of uncertainty. But John knew there was no turning back now. He needed answers, and every location Clara mentioned seemed to bring him closer to the truth he had avoided for so long. Sophia continued searching the room while John approached a rusted door in the corner. It was slightly ajar, creaking as he pushed it open. Beyond it lay a dark hallway, the scent of mildew and rust filling the air. "Over here," he muttered to Sophia, who quickly joined him. Together, they moved down the narrow corridor, their footsteps echoing ominously. The hallway led them to a smaller room, where the walls were covered in old, decaying papers, some scattered on the floor, others tacked onto the walls with rusted nails. Black and white photographs. Faces that John didn't immediately recognize, but as he stepped closer, one face stood out. Clara. She looked much younger in the photo, perhaps in her early teens. Next to her, more young faces, including Matt Harris. The missing were all here. A cold shiver ran down John's spine. This was no coincidence. These young people were connected in ways he had never considered. Sophia carefully peeled one of the papers from the wall, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of the scribbled notes. "Looks like a list," she said, pointing to the names. "They all went missing around the same time, John." He moved closer to study the list with her. Clara's name was at the top. Matt Harris right below. And there were more names he didn't recognize immediately, but whose faces were on the photos spread across the walls. The truth was undeniable now. These disappearances, once thought to be isolated, were connected by something much larger and much more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Whoever was behind this had been watching, documenting. John felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It was as if Clara had known all along, as if she had been trying to lead them to uncover what really happened to her and the others. John's phone buzzed again in his pocket, breaking the heavy silence of the room. He glanced at the screen, already expecting the call, Clara's name lighting up the display. This time, he didn't hesitate. He answered, his eyes locked on the faces of the victims staring back at him from the wall. Clara's voice was clearer now, but there was an urgency to her tone that hadn't been there before. "Did you find what I wanted?" she asked, almost as if she were standing beside him, watching his every move. John, without speaking, glanced at Sophia, who was still searching the room. "Yes," he finally replied, keeping his tone steady. "The photos, the others. They were all connected, weren't they?" The line was silent for a moment before Clara's soft voice whispered again. "He made me watch it all. I saw them disappear. One by one. I knew he would come for me too." Those words froze John's blood. The he Clara was referring to had never been mentioned before. Who was he? John's mind raced, searching for answers, but before he could ask, Clara continued. "He's coming back. And when he does, you need to be ready. You can't trust anyone, John. No one." The line went dead, leaving a thick silence filled with unanswered questions. John stared at the phone, the last words Clara spoke echoing in his mind. "He's coming back." Sophia approached, noticing John's expression shift. "What did she say?" she asked, but John hesitated before answering. Clara's words filled him with distrust. Who was this he that Clara had mentioned? And, more disturbingly, was Sophia somehow involved? The thin line between reality and paranoia was beginning to blur. He needed to stay calm, but something about his former partner made him question everything. "She mentioned someone," John finally replied. "Someone who was watching all the disappearances. Clara, Matt. And the others." Sophia frowned, processing the information but asking no further questions. She knew they were diving into something much bigger than they had anticipated. Whatever it was about to emerge from the shadows. Before they could leave the warehouse, Sophia pointed to a corner of the room where a small safe was partially buried under debris. John moved to help her clear the rubble. The safe was locked, but Sophia, always prepared, pulled out a small tool from her bag and began working on the lock. Time seemed to drag as she fidgeted with the mechanism until finally, a soft click echoed in the room. She opened the safe, revealing a stack of old documents and a small, worn-out cassette tape. John picked up the tape, staring at it for a moment before slipping it into his pocket. He knew that piece of plastic held secrets that could change everything. "We need a place to listen to this," he said, and Sophia nodded in agreement. They knew the night was far from over. The mystery they were unraveling was just beginning to reveal its darkest layers, and every new discovery was pulling them closer to a danger they couldn't yet predict. The tension between them was palpable as they left the warehouse, leaving the unlocked safe behind, filled with more questions than answers. Outside, the darkness seemed heavier, as if the very air was conspiring to hide whatever was waiting for them in the next step. The morning light was just beginning to break as John and Sophia left the warehouse. The air still held a chill, and the silence around them seemed heavier than usual, as if the very world around them was harboring secrets. The cassette tape in John's pocket felt as heavy as lead, filled with the weight of disturbing promises. He knew that whatever was on that tape could crack open the dark truths that had remained buried for too long. On the drive back, the car moved through the deserted streets in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Sophia, ever the professional, remained focused, her eyes locked on the road. But John could sense the tension gnawing at her too. Something in the look she gave him told him that she was more involved than she wanted to admit. The name Clara mentioned in the last call, him, still echoed in John's mind. Who was this shadowy figure Clara claimed to have seen? And, more disturbingly, how was he tied to everything? Every time John tried to piece it together, the image became more distorted, more fragmented, as if someone was manipulating the puzzle to confuse him. When they arrived at John's house, Sophia suggested they listen to the tape immediately. He agreed with a nod, and they both entered his small home office, where he kept an old tape player, a relic from his days as a detective. He pulled it from the shelf, feeling an uneasy chill as he inserted the tape. The moment it began to play, the sound was nothing but low static, almost imperceptible. Then, a voice emerged, not Clara's, but a man's. It was rough, distorted, like it was coming through a thick layer of interference. They think I'm dead. But I'm always close. Always watching. Each one of them is just a piece. Clara. Matt. The others, all part of something bigger. The voice paused for a moment, the static returning before the recording continued. This time, the tone was darker, almost threatening. John Parker, you thought you'd left it all behind. But you never left the game. It's all just beginning. John froze, his eyes locking with Sophia's. The tape was talking directly to him. The mystery, which had already seemed enormous, had just become personal in a way he never could have predicted. The words echoed in his mind, and the tension in the room grew with each second. How did this person know so much about him? And, worse, what did they want? Sophia remained silent, but John could see in her eyes that she was processing the same thing. They were being played in a much larger game, one where the rules were unclear and the danger was real. The static returned one last time before the tape abruptly ended. The silence that followed was thick, filled with questions that had no easy answers. John turned off the player and stared at it for a few seconds, trying to steady the whirlwind of thoughts swirling through his head. Whoever this is, they're manipulating us, Sophia said, her voice low but steady. Clara mentioned someone was watching her. This could mean she knew something much bigger all along, but was too scared to say. John nodded, his eyes distant as he absorbed her words. Everything was starting to point to one conclusion: someone inside the police force was involved. And the only person who could have access to such sensitive information about the disappearances was his old mentor, Captain Martin Barrows. John felt his stomach churn. Barrows had always been the model officer, but there had always been something reserved about him. Now, years later, John was beginning to see the shadows of what Barrows might have been hiding. Clara had said he made her watch the disappearances, that he was always near. And who had always been near all the major cases? Barrows. John's mind began piecing it together, but he still lacked solid proof. I need to confront Barrows, John said, turning to Sophia with a look that left no room for doubt. He needed answers. He needed to know how deep Barrows' involvement went, and if he was truly the he Clara had been talking about. Sophia remained silent for a moment, then reluctantly nodded. But be careful, she warned. If Barrows is involved, he knows we're closing in on the truth. He could make a move before we have a chance. John knew she was right. Barrows had always been smart, a master manipulator. If he was behind Clara's and Matt's disappearances, it meant he was already several steps ahead. John and Sophia would have to play their cards carefully if they wanted to take him down. Still, the only way to find Clara, to resolve all of this once and for all, was to confront Barrows. He had always been there, watching, manipulating, and now John knew that the only way to expose the truth was to face him head-on. As the night dragged on, John mentally prepared himself for what was to come. Confronting Barrows wouldn't be easy, but he knew he had no choice. Everything he had avoided for so long was now converging on a single point: the truth was about to be revealed, no matter how dark it might be. The weight of discovering that Captain Martin Barrows might be involved in a web of secrets tied to the disappearances of Clara and Matt left John more shaken than he wanted to admit. He and Sophia drove to the police station, where they knew Barrows would be. The silence in the car was suffocating, but both of them were laser-focused on what had to come next. A confrontation was inevitable, and John needed answers. As they neared the building, the city was just beginning to stir with the rhythm of a new day, but for John, this day carried the specter of a past he could no longer ignore. The man he once respected and admired was about to be confronted, and the fallout could be disastrous. But if Barrows was involved, there was no other way forward. In the station's parking lot, Sophia parked the car in a discreet spot, and the two of them stepped out into the cold morning air. They walked through the station's reception without drawing much attention. John knew Barrows would be in his office by now. He always arrived early, and the station's morning routine would help them blend in unnoticed. When they reached the dark wood door of Barrows' office, John felt adrenaline pumping through his veins. He gave a light knock, and when Barrows' deep voice responded, they entered, Sophia close behind. The captain, now older but still commanding, looked up from the papers on his desk and gave a slight, controlled smile, a smile John always read as condescending. "Parker. I didn't expect to see you here." "And with Sophia, no less," Barrows said, his deep voice sounding almost friendly, but John could sense something beneath that surface. A layer of control Barrows always maintained over every situation, as though he knew more than anyone else in the room. "We need to talk," John began, keeping his voice firm despite the nervous energy building inside him. He knew he was walking a fine line. "About Clara Thompson. And Matt Harris." The words landed heavily, charged with implications Barrows surely understood at once. The captain's face remained neutral for a moment, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, and the silence that followed was almost tangible. John could feel the pressure mounting by the second. Barrows knew they had caught him off guard, but he didn't show any signs of weakness. "Clara Thompson. That's an old case. And Matt Harris? You two really want to dig through those dusty files now?" Barrows responded calmly, but John could detect a subtle tremor in his voice. The man who had once commanded every room now seemed to be losing his grip on the situation. Sophia stepped forward, her body language tense but deliberate. "We know there's more than what's in those old files, Captain. We've received information linking the disappearances to something bigger. Something you could clear up, if you're willing." Her voice was steady, but it carried an undercurrent of tension. She knew that pushing too hard could make Barrows react unpredictably. Barrows remained motionless, his calculating eyes shifting between the two of them. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk, and spoke in a lower, almost threatening tone. "You think you've got all the answers, but you don't know a thing. This game started long before you even knew how it worked. If I were you, I'd leave it alone." The silence that followed was sharp. Barrows' words carried a weight that made it clear he knew much more than he was letting on. John glanced at Sophia, trying to gauge her reaction. He knew Barrows was involved. Everything pointed to him. But the captain was holding back, trying to keep them in the dark. John couldn't let this continue. You were there, weren't you, Barrows? During the disappearances. Clara saw you. You let her watch it all. And you're connected to Matt's disappearance, too. All the names on that wall, all the photos. You've been close this whole time. Barrows' face hardened, and John could see his control slipping away. The captain stood up from his chair, his fists clenched, but his voice remained cold and calculated. You're in deep water, Parker. Too deep. And if you keep going, you're not going to like what you find. Not you, not Clara, not anyone. Barrows began walking toward the door, clearly irritated, but before he could leave, Sophia stepped in front of him, blocking his exit. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken threats. John knew this was the turning point. Barrows wasn't going to admit anything outright, but it was obvious now that he was hiding something. Whatever Barrows was involved in, it was bigger than John had ever imagined. You can't keep covering this up, Barrows. People are disappearing. They're dying. And you're at the center of it. We won't stop until the truth comes out. John took the final step, facing Barrows head-on. He had to break through the captain's defenses, make him understand that this game was coming to an end. Barrows paused for a moment, his eyes locked onto John's, before giving a cold, thin smile and stepping back. You two have no idea what you're getting into, he murmured before slipping out the door, leaving John and Sophia in his office with more questions than answers. But now they knew they were close. Very close to uncovering what really happened to Clara and Matt. The confrontation with Barrows had made it clear that the truth was hidden somewhere, and John was more determined than ever to uncover the full extent of this dark conspiracy. John and Sophia stood in Barrows' office for a few minutes after he left, both of them processing the impact of their conversation. The captain's behavior, the coldness with which he warned them about deep waters, confirmed what John had feared. Barrows was more involved than he let on. The gravity of their discovery weighed heavily on both of them, and now they had to decide their next move. They knew that by confronting Barrows, they had crossed a line. Sophia was the first to break the silence, her voice low but urgent. He's trying to corner us. If we keep going, Barrows is going to make a move. He knows we're close. John knew she was right. Barrows had always been calculating, and now that he realized they were connecting the dots, his response could be dangerous. But turning back wasn't an option anymore. We have to find Clara, John said, his eyes locking on Sophia's. She's the key to all of this. If we can find her, we can figure out just how deep this goes. Sophia nodded, but they both understood that this would be more difficult than they had thought. Clara was alive, but in hiding, perhaps still under the watch of whoever was behind this network of disappearances. Back in the car, Sophia started digging through recent records on Barrows. She knew the captain had something to hide, and whatever clues were buried in the police database could be their way to finding Clara. Hours passed as they scoured through records, and then, something caught Sophia's eye. Look at this, she said, pointing to a series of financial records. A property under the name of a front company, purchased over 20 years ago. In the middle of nowhere, southeast of here. John glanced at the documents. An isolated location, far from the city, where no one would see what was happening. John's intuition kicked in, this had to be where Clara was. It had to be. They decided not to waste any time. They left immediately, the silence in the car thick with expectation. The road was long and deserted, and as they drew closer, dark clouds began to gather in the sky, as if the weather itself knew something dangerous was about to unfold. The air was dense, and the sound of the tires on the asphalt reverberated in John's mind like a warning. When they arrived at the property, an old shed in the middle of an abandoned field, John felt a wave of déjà vu. Something about this place seemed eerily familiar. He got out of the car, Sophia close behind, and they cautiously approached the structure. The shed was locked, but a faint light escaped through the cracks in the windows. Someone was inside. Maybe Clara. Or something worse. The tension in the air mounted with every step they took, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot only amplifying the feeling of being watched. Sophia glanced at John, and he signaled for her to follow him quietly. The door was slightly ajar, making it easy to slip inside without much noise. As they entered, the dimly lit interior revealed a sight John would never forget. In the center of the room, tied to a chair, was Clara. She was worn, pale, but alive. Her vacant gaze scanned the room until it landed on John, and he felt his chest tighten at the sight of her condition. Clara had been held there, a witness to horrors they still couldn't fully comprehend. But before they could move toward her, a voice echoed through the room. "I warned you that you were getting in too deep." John turned slowly to face Martin Barrows, emerging from the shadows, his cold eyes fixed on both of them. He held a gun in his hand, his expression calm but filled with a suppressed rage. Barrows knew this was the endgame, the moment he still had control. "It's over, Barrows," John said, trying to keep his voice steady as he calculated the possible outcomes of this moment. "You can't hide anything anymore. Everything's here, and Clara is the proof." Barrows laughed, a cold, bitter sound that bounced off the metal walls of the shed. "You really think this is just about Clara? She's just a piece. You're trying to destroy something far bigger than you can even imagine." John knew Barrows was trying to buy time, to manipulate the situation. He had seen this before. But this time, he wouldn't let Barrows slip away. As the captain continued to speak, John gave a subtle signal to Sophia, who began to move slowly toward the side of the shed, trying to flank Barrows. Clara, though weak, managed to speak, her voice broken but audible. "John. He's not alone. There are others. They're going to keep going." Her words cut through John like a knife. Barrows wasn't acting alone. There were more people involved, more individuals connected to this web of disappearances and control. But before John could fully process what Clara was saying, the sound of a gunshot shattered the air, and the confrontation they had been dreading began. Sophia, quick as always, tackled Barrows before he could fire another shot, disarming him while John rushed to free Clara. The room erupted into chaos for a few minutes, but soon Barrows was subdued, his weapon out of reach, and Clara, though too weak to run, finally looked relieved. The confrontation was over, but the war wasn't. Barrows was in their custody, but Clara's words still echoed. "He's not alone." This was only the beginning, and John knew that uncovering the full truth would be longer and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in John's mind as he rushed to untie Clara. His hands were shaking, driven by the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He could hardly believe they had made it this far, that they finally had Barrows under control. But Clara's words, weak and filled with fear, kept replaying in his mind. "He's not alone." While Sophia kept Barrows pinned on the ground, John worked quickly to free Clara from the ropes that held her to the chair. She was fragile, almost without strength, but her eyes still burned with a determination that hadn't been extinguished by the years of captivity. "We're getting you out of here," he whispered, helping her to her feet. She nodded, but her gaze said something else, something deeper, something John still couldn't fully understand. "He's not alone, John," Clara repeated, her voice faint as she leaned against him. "There are more. So many more." Her words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Whatever Barrows was involved in, it was part of something much larger, a network of disappearances, control, and manipulation that John still hadn't fully grasped. And now, with Barrows pinned to the floor, the weight of that reality was beginning to crash down on him. If there were others, they were still out there, hidden, watching, waiting for the right moment to act. Sophia glanced at John, clearly waiting for his decision. Barrows, disarmed and pinned beneath her, looked up at them with a calm, sinister smile that unnerved John more than any violence ever could. "You think this ends here, Parker?" he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Even if you arrest me, the game goes on. You don't even understand it yet, do you?" John could feel the anger rising inside him. He wanted to end it, to stop the lies once and for all, but he knew Barrows was right. Arresting him was only the first step. "Who else is involved?" John demanded, his voice tense, but Barrows only laughed, a low, chilling sound. "What do you think, Parker? You think you can take this down by yourself? We're everywhere. And while you're here, others are already making their next move. You can't stop what you don't even understand." The weight of Barrows' words hit John hard. He knew now that what they were facing was far bigger than just one man. But Clara was still alive, and that meant there was hope to expose the truth. With Barrows in custody, they had a chance to bring the whole thing crashing down, at least part of it. Before they could leave the shed, John's phone vibrated. An unknown number. The chill that ran down his spine as he looked at the screen was familiar, reminding him of all the mysterious calls he had received throughout the investigation. Hesitantly, he answered, the silence on the other end broken only by the sound of slow, deliberate breathing. "You think you've won, John?" The voice on the other end was distorted, but familiar in a terrifying way. "You've caught one man, but there are more of us. Many more. And we're watching." The terror hit John like a wave, the threat wrapping around him like a tight noose. Whatever was happening, it went far beyond Barrows. It was a network, an organization operating in the shadows, and capturing Barrows wouldn't be the end. John could feel the pressure building, but he couldn't afford to let fear take over. Not now. Sophia approached, sensing the shock on John's face as he ended the call. She knew something else had happened, something he hadn't yet spoken aloud. "What was it?" she asked, her voice steady but her eyes filled with concern. "It's not just Barrows," John replied, his voice heavy. "I just got another call. They know what we're doing. And they're watching." Clara, still weak, lifted her head, her dark eyes marked with the terror of years spent as a captive. "He always knew, John. They know everything." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word hit like a hammer. John looked around, as if expecting something to come out of the shadows of the shed. But the silence inside was thick, oppressive. They had to get out of there, fast, before it was too late. "We need to get Clara to safety," he said to Sophia, who immediately agreed. As they helped Clara out of the shed, Barrows, still on the ground, let out a disturbing laugh. "Take her. Protect her. But you can't save her. No one can." The car was waiting outside, and John carefully helped Clara into the back seat. Sophia started the engine, but before they drove off, John looked back at Barrows one last time. The man was defeated, but the sense that something larger was in play haunted him. As they sped down the deserted road, John's heart still raced, a mix of relief and dread. They had Clara, but so much more was still at stake. The drive back to the city was tense. Every shadow beside the road seemed to move, every car they passed felt like a threat waiting to strike. John knew they were now dealing with something far more complex than just a kidnapping. This was a conspiracy. And he had only just scratched the surface. When they arrived at the safe house where Clara would be protected, John helped her out of the car. Sophia was already on the phone with trusted authorities, people they could count on. Clara needed medical attention, but her safety was the top priority. They were one step closer to exposing the truth, but they knew the real battle was yet to come. As they settled Clara into a secure room, John's phone vibrated again. This time, it was a text message. Just 2 words, "We're close." The threat was clear. Whatever Barrows and his accomplices had been hiding, they were now closing in on John and Sophia. John felt the weight of everything that was coming. The fight was far from over, and he knew he had to prepare for the worst. But now, with Clara safe for the moment, they had a chance to expose everything and finally put an end to the cycle of disappearances and death. The war wasn't over yet. But John was ready.